Hello, and welcome to the Radiant Mission podcast. My name is Rebecca Toomey, and I'm here with my amazing co host and sister, Rachel Smith.
Hey, everyone.
We are on a mission to encourage and inspire you as you're navigating through your life and with your relationship with Yahweh. And today we are back. We're back. It's crazy how long it's been since we've recorded.
I know I was thinking about it yesterday when we planned to record today, that the last time we recorded was our Christmas episodes, and I was like 39 weeks pregnant. Actually, I might have been like almost 40. No, I was 39 weeks. Anyway, and now it's almost Christmas, and we've had our babies, and we are recording my birth story.
Yeah, last time we were recording, it was the spring, and now it's
Yeah.
winter. We did so many pre-recorded episodes, which is great. It was
Yeah.
awesome to just be editing podcasts for the last 10 months or
6
whatever it's
months.
been.
6 months.
6 I can't do math anymore. That's how bad it's gotten since the last time we've recorded.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's crazy.
So
Yeah, it's been a long time, so there's a lot to catch up on. The last
yes.
that you guys heard on this show, we are both about to have our 3rd babies, and now we have had them and they're
Now I have a
old now.
6-month-old baby.
Rachel's, yeah,
Yeah.
yours is 6 minus 4 months, and
Mhm.
it's been a wild ride. So we're really excited to get into the details leading up to your birth, and I just wanna kind of queue up because if you're new here or jumped in on just this episode, we like to work in mini series
Mhm.
topics. That's just kind of the way that we've been doing things. And we've talked about birth in the past, but there's just more to say, continued. And as we're learning more, there's more to say as well.
As we have
So,
more babies, there's more
and
to
as we
say.
have more babies and more experiences, yeah.
Well, and we
So,
like to just do birth stories from time to time, and
yeah.
both of us have told both of our previous birth stories before.
Mhm.
So I would say if you're listening to this episode now, I know a lot of people who know me or have been listening to the podcast have been very curious about my birth story this time around because my previous two were both C-sections.
Yeah.
So if you haven't heard those, go back. Do you know what episodes those were, Rebecca?
I think there were 10 and 11 actually,
So you can
off the
listen
top of
to
my head.
those birth stories for my first son and my second son. Both of them were C-sections. And then this is going to be my third birth story. And it was a spoiler alert, a VBAC after both of the C-sections. It's cool to me anyway, since this is my life and I've experienced the stories in real time, to know where I've come from
Mhm.
before hearing this story today.
Yeah.
But if you don't and listen to this one first, like that's fine too.
Did I say 10 and 11?
Yeah, were you right?
I was right. Man,
Wow.
I've got a
Okay,
memory
we
for
still
these
got a few
episodes.
brain cells.
I only have a few left, but the ones I do, I remembered your original episodes. Yeah, I definitely recommend folks go back and listen to Rachel's original birth stories so you can listen to how far she's come because it's literally your exit, this birth anyway, is really your exit from the traditional medical model for birth.
It's
And
gonna be
that's
very
why
different.
it's very different. And so we're actually going to be splitting Rachel's story into 3 episodes because there's kind of a before, a during, and an end, right? There's
Mhm,
what you did to prepare to have a VBAC after 2 C-sections and 2 breech births, mind
mhm.
you. So that's going to be a different approach to it. And then we're going to talk about your actual birth, which is I think going to be very exciting to recall and retell because I was there too.
I know,
And this
that I was
is
thinking about that because this is gonna be a unique birth story on this podcast. It's gonna be the first one that both of us were there for, that,
it's true.
like, I was in labor land, so there's stuff that has softened and I've probably forgotten, but you were there with a camera front and center, so you can almost fill in some gaps.
Yeah, I got a lot to say about that and a lot of footage that no one will ever see.
Even me, I haven't even watched it all.
Yeah. There's a lot. There's a lot to say about that, so I'm excited we're gonna be talking about that next week.
Yeah.
This and
Mhm.
then the week after, we're gonna talk about your transition because things are very different for you than they were the first 1 or 2 times you had kids. Because this is now the 3rd time,
Mhm.
and you had a baby, a natural birth after not having
C-section.
natural birth, so that was a different experience
Yeah.
postpartum.
Recovery,
Postpartum
yeah.
via C-section versus non.
Yeah.
And then you also have older kids, you're going through breastfeeding again after not having kids for 5 years,
Oh,
you're going through sleep
we could
after
do
not
a
having kids for 5 years, so
well, we could do a mini series on
your life
breastfeeding
in the
this
last 6
time
months.
and sleep this time. That is not happening still, so it's definitely been
Yeah,
different.
well,
Yeah.
we wanna hear from you guys if you think that it would be oh, no. My microphone is unplugged. Just kidding. It's not my microphone, it was just the plug. It looked
Oh
like
my
my microphone. I was
I was gonna
like,
say
"No!"
after all of this.
After all of this. So just to cue you guys back, I'm not even gonna edit this out. You guys, this morning, getting ready, not even this morning, it's the afternoon. It feels like it's been since the morning. Preparing to edit today or record today, I mean, was like a huge hurdle for both of us because we're first of all have not done this for a long time. But
Yeah.
second of all, I thought let's start back the strongest way we can with a totally new technology. Let's do that
And let's
for our
figure it out right when we're supposed to start recording.
Let's do that, and we'll figure it out right when we start recording, right when our kids go down for their nap so that we can get this recording done. Let's do that. So we spent 40 minutes troubleshooting, and I have a brand new computer and couldn't even use my brand new computer to record because it wouldn't connect to my microphone. So anyway, that's the context here. It has been a lot of fun in between the last time we recorded and now when it comes to some new things that have gone on because if you've been listening to the show that you know that I am the one that also edits the show and posts it. So I've been trying to find tools to make it easier. And this tool that I'm using is recording Rachel and I separately because something that I ran into multiple times was one person's audio would be messed up, be it me. That happened actually when for I think it was 2 or 3 episodes, and I was at Rachel's house editing these episodes, and I had to literally edit my audio every single time I spoke, or the other person. It depended on who talked more. I would edit that
Yeah,
person.
Rebecca regularly stays up till like 4 a.m. editing these episodes. So hopefully this new technology makes it so you don't have to do that. But
Hopefully, I'm trying to find things that make it easier to edit and record, and so if
we got
one of
too
us
many kids now to
Yeah,
be
I
moving the
can't be
hard way.
fiddling around editing for 4 or 5 hours. It's just not gonna work. So anyway,
Yeah.
I had a panic moment when I thought that my microphone unplugged because that
After all of
although I
that.
would have been recorded separately, so I could have fixed it. So anyway, folks, here's what you can expect. We are in a birth series, and this birth series is called God's Design for Birth. And we want to talk about what we have been learning about his design for birth, his design for pregnancy, all of this stuff, because we have been lied to a lot from the mainstream medical model that birth is an emergency, that pregnancy is a illness or a condition or a disease. And we want to debunk a lot of that. And so that's what we're doing right now in this series is just talking about birth from a God perspective and a design perspective. So we'll keep that in mind as we're going through Rachel's stories. We're going to talk about how she prepared to have a VBAC, and this applies even if you are not in the same situation. It's going to help to talk about preparing for birth. Then we're going to talk about her birth story, which is a VBAC at a birthing center after 2 C-sections. And then we're going to talk about her journey post. So let's jump into our first topic today, and that is your birth. So, where do you want to start with this? Where do you want to start with preparing for a VBAC?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this because I think one of the reasons we're not just like jumping into my birth story and me going into labor is what I want people to who are listening to know, especially if you are pregnant or planning to get pregnant, is preparing for a VBAC and the story that I can now tell, it didn't just happen because I just woke up in labor and winged it. Like,
Oops.
it w yeah, it was 9 months of preparation. Like, I planned and prayed through every decision and everything I did, and my whole life was consumed by, "I'm going to deliver this baby naturally." And the more prepared you are, the more likely you are to be successful. So if you're just
Mhm.
like, "Oh, I'll just see what happens," that's I'm sorry, but, like, it's not gonna happen the way you want.
Yeah,
So,
it's true.
I mean, maybe for some lucky people it will, but I had
If
that
there isn't
mentality.
fear there, maybe those people might get lucky because they don't have the fear, but the
Right.
problem is when you go into it with that mentality of, "We'll just see what happens," then when it happens, you panic because you haven't prepared.
Right, yeah, and I had never experienced labor before, so I
Mhm,
didn't know what the pain was gonna feel like or lack thereof, or I didn't know what a contraction felt like. I both of my C-sections before were scheduled because my
mhm,
sons were breech. So, I think where to start in the story is I had in my mind the significance of the position of the baby from the moment I got pregnant,
mhm,
because both of my previous sons were breech. And I knew from my second, which I didn't know that there was anything I could do to possibly prevent a breech baby from early in pregnancy. So I did nothing and I just winged it. And lo and behold, he was breech at like 25 weeks and never flipped again.
mhm.
So, this being my third rodeo, I was determined that that's not gonna be my situation again. But if it is, because I am more likely to have breech babies because I have a bicornuate uterus, then I am going to find a provider that will support me in a natural breech birth, because I
Mm,
knew just winging it and picking a VBAC friendly OB or something like that, if my baby ended up breech, I would have no second option that late in pregnancy. So I really thought of this from the moment I got pregnant, of finding the right provider who would support me. So starting there, I found out I was pregnant. I knew I didn't want to give birth in a hospital. Also, didn't really, we've talked a lot about home birth because you have had multiple home births now
mhm.
and even free birthing. I didn't want to home birth because at the time when I got pregnant, I was living in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah,
So there wasn't even a
yeah.
midwife within an hour away from me.
Mhm,
And also there was no hospital, because that's the thing too, is while I tell this story and I hoped and prayed for a physiological out of the hospital birth, you still make decisions with wisdom for, emergency situation if anything happened. So
yeah.
to be an hour away from any hospital when you are VBACing after 2 C-sections and possibly a breech baby, it didn't feel, in my situation, something I was comfortable with.
Let's pause there for a second because I think that this is definitely something for us to talk about, and I think that our audience and those listening might face the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Whenever you are going through a pregnancy and planning for a birth, this is a piece of that you have to make the decision if you're considering home birth or you're considering a birthing center or even a hospital
Mhm.
is how comfortable do I feel with emergency situations? How well do I know emergency situations? How much do I want to know about emergency situations? And it's a very personal thing that I think every person they have to come to that choice and that
Mhm.
decision on what's best for them. Some people live far away from hospitals and say, even if I live far away from a hospital, I'm still gonna free birth, for example. Or they may say, well, because I live an hour away, I actually think I want to get an Airbnb closer to where I'm going to, where there's a
That's something
hospital
I
and birth
that's
there.
something I considered, yeah.
Because that's the thing is these are all things that we as women have to weigh and have to factor. And this was a definite thing for you that being far out in the country after having 2 C-sections, it's not like you had a home birth already,
Right.
and now we're gonna have a home birth at a new house, and it's kinda in the country. So,
Mhm.
I do think that this is an important area for us to just pause and think about.
Mhm. Yeah,
And what
making the decision that is everyone is in a different circumstance. If I was a first-time mom living that far out, honestly, a home birth probably would have been better and easier.
Mhm,
I was intimidated by the thought of having a far drive in labor,
mhm,
but, it's and then obviously the circumstances of what risks that we each are facing, because
yeah.
that's gonna be different for every woman. And for me, I knew I could do this. I knew that the Lord was calling me to it. But I also am not an idiot. I know that my uterus has been cut open twice. I knew I was healed, but I also knew I had a bicornuate uterus. And again, I knew I might have another VBAC baby. So there, I don't
How do
want
you
people to.
how what would you say about your fear level? Like, do you feel like you were more nervous and afraid when making that decision than you feel today? Like, I think that your decisions today might be different than your decisions were then even.
Probably, yeah. I wouldn't say that I felt. Oh, you just cut out. Are you there?
I didn't cut out. I just
Oh.
was turned off my camera so I could open the blinds.
Oh, okay, sorry. I wouldn't say that I felt necessarily fearful. If I was afraid of anything, it was afraid of going back to the hospital and having a C-section.
Hmm,
So,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
I today on the other side of this experience, decisions could be made differently because I've now had a VBAC, but at that point in time, I had a traumatic C-section with my second, and I was afraid of that. And also there was, I don't necessarily think it fear is the right word, but there was a level of caution about another breach. And you and I talked about this a lot during my pregnancy. It's not
Yeah.
that I was afraid of another breech baby. It's I was afraid of the the memories and the emotions that another breech baby would bring up in me, because it would trigger everything I went through the first 2 times, and I didn't wanna deal with that in pregnancy, honestly. So, one thing in my experience of choosing where I wanted to birth and the provider. So, I started literally a week after I got my positive pregnancy test interviewing midwives. And this is something that I would highly recommend to women is you don't just have to meet with one midwife or doctor and then that's it. Like, I probably had phone calls with at least 5 or 6, and I interviewed an OB as well, who was apparently the most VBAC friendly OB in my area. The practice is apparently, allows, quote unquote, "allows" even VBAC after 2 C-sections, because that was something I faced. Like, I called some of the most popular birthing centers with midwives in my area, and they wouldn't even consider me because I've had 2 C-sections. They would only take VBACs
Mhm.
after 1 C-section, which is
So isn't that
the
interesting? This is kind of the whole core of our series here, right? God's design for our bodies and birth, that the very people whose job is to assist a woman during the labor time are that afraid of the outcome of birth. They have a lot of fear surrounding it now. Of
yeah,
course, you could say, well, they've seen terrible things happen and they've seen risk. But the issue with yours is that these people came back to you and said, well, we just don't know. We have no idea. We don't have any data on your
right.
specific data set because your
So
uterus is that unique.
so
So
yes,
you're your own data set.
that is what the OB said to me that I interviewed, that they would only take me on as a patient. It really in that, appointment, I feel like they were, like, interviewing me as much as I was interviewing them once they realized I wasn't going to go along with their protocols, and the doctor did say to me what you just said, that they would not feel comfortable allowing me to VBAC with the lack of research for women who have bicornuate uteruses and are VBACing and VBACing after 2 C-sections. There's just no data. So because there's no data, they wouldn't feel comfortable with me as a patient unless I agreed to a scheduled C-section. And I was like, "So what if I showed up at the hospital in labor? Then what would happen?" And this is where I could tell she was so annoyed with me. She was like, "Well, if that's your plan, then you should find a provider who's more comfortable with your situation." I'm like, "Okay, well, great, I will."
Okay, riddle me this. If you showed up in labor to a hospital and no one had your records and you didn't
Right, I wouldn't
say
even
to
know.
them, if you didn't say, "I've had 2 C-sections prior to this," and you just went through the birthing process like a normal person, I mean, how much different would things
And
be?
that nobody can know, that I have a bicornuate uterus either. She wouldn't even
It's
have
not like they
known
can
in that
see it.
appointment because you can't see my bicornuate uterus in a ultrasound,
Ultrasound.
and the ultrasound tech even said when she did, it was one of the only ultrasounds I had in my pregnancy was for that appointment. She said, Your uterus looks totally normal." So if it wasn't for me telling the doctor that, she wouldn't even know. So this was it's so, I mean, I'm not saying to, like, not share your medical history with
Of course.
people, but
Of course.
it's just interesting these decisions they make.
There's
Anyway,
I guess what you're trying to say is there's something that's not present that if they didn't know, would they have fear? Would
right.
the fear be creeping up? This
Yes.
actually brings up a good point. There was a video recently, Dr. Stu, who was on our podcast, which listen to those episodes because 'cause they're bomb. He was on our podcast, but he was interviewed by what was it, The Today Show or something like that? The Daily
The
Show?
Daily Show, yeah.
The Daily Show, and there's a little tiny clip of his interview where he talks about how OBs are trained to fear birth, and the comments went wild on that
Oh,
one.
yeah. A lot of haters.
A lot of
People,
people like, "Oh,
"You
no,
should
it's
fear
not
birth,
normal."
birth is scary."
Yeah, you should be afraid because birth is scary, and it's like, "No. Why are we afraid of a physiological function? We're not afraid to go in the bathroom and go number 2, are we?
Well,
No."
and so that is my experience in the one OB that I interviewed in my preparation process is essentially what she said to me is, "There's not enough data, so we're afraid of your body and your uterus, and we don't know what would happen, so we don't wanna be a part of that. That makes us uncomfortable." That was that's a summary of what I was told in my own words
And
because
you
it
get to
is
say the same, right?
fear.
Respectfully, then bye.
Yeah, it's like, "Okay, like, I don't need you." I didn't want to I didn't I knew I like I said, I knew I wanted to give birth outside of the hospital anyways,
Yeah.
but I just wanted to say that I guess interviewed, and I actually wanted the ultrasound because this was when I was about 10 or so weeks, so I, just wanted to confirm there was 1 baby and all that anyway, so and I had actually already selected my midwife by that point. So, to just briefly talk about the process of selecting my midwife then is I interviewed a ton of midwives. I, through the grapevine, found the only at the time that I knew of midwife who had experience with breech delivery. And I interviewed her and she was very sweet. I really liked her. She had told me about the breech experience she had. She was very honest and upfront. This is one thing I like about midwives, for the most part, at least in my experience and talking to so many of them. They don't like BS as much as OBs do. Like they're very honest and vulnerable about what they are capable of and what they're not. Because there were plenty of midwives that I talked to who still spent an hour talking to me, like as I was like crying, but also saying like I would not feel comfortable delivering a breech baby. And that's totally fine. Like if someone doesn't have experience or training, they shouldn't be agreeing to that. And so she did have experience, and she said that for her breech, for the amount of times that she was assisting a breech delivery, they transferred to the hospital 50% of the time. And that to me was like, wow, that's not a good number. And
No.
I remember asking her how she would feel if we were looking at a breech delivery, because it would be in the end, like once you're at the end of pregnancy, if that's what we were planning for, how would you feel with that? And she said, I'm going to be honest with you, there would be a certain level of stress for me. And I would not put that on you, but there is a I would be a lot more hands-on than I normally am. And I said, "Okay, like I appreciate your answer." To me, I heard a little bit of fear there. And that was fine, but I needed someone who was not going to be afraid of this with me. And while I was researching midwives, because of wonderful, trailblazing birth practitioners like Dr. Stu, who advocate for training midwives and OBs in vaginal breech delivery, I knew about an organization called Breech Without Borders. So I was in a Facebook group for support for Breech Without Borders. And on their website, I looked up, they had a provider index that you could put in your area and look up providers who have taken their education classes to learn how to safely deliver vaginal breech. And on there, I saw a midwife listed that I looked up, and that she actually had a birthing center, and it was about an hour and a half from where I was living at the time. And I looked up the birthing center, and it looked great, and I called her and I set up an appointment to meet with her, and I interviewed her in person. And at that point, I had also interviewed the other midwife who actually had experience. And what I realized in the midwife that has the birthing center, that she is a Christian, a very strong woman of God. She has the same values as I do, and she is a huge advocate for physiological birth, because not every midwife is. Some of them are very hands on, but she was a huge advocate for physiological birth, and her passion is actually in VBAC. She's had clients who were VBACing after 2, 3, even 4 C-sections. And sh she also really took seriously continual training as a midwife for things like twin birth and breech. That's why she was listed on the Breech Without Borders website, having taken their
Mhm.
classes. And so when I asked her, I like interrogated her practically about how she felt about breech, her training experience, her personal experience. And I got the impression that she hadn't actually physically been at very many breech births for how long she
Mhm.
has been a midwife. But one thing I did learn is that it is pretty uncommon for a midwife to have been at very many breech births, because most women aren't doing it. Most women who
True.
find out they have a breech baby are going to the hospital and having a C-section, or their
Mhm.
midwife is sending them to the hospital to have a C-section because they're not trained or comfortable with it. So she had a few, but not as many as the other woman. But she took very seriously being trained in how to do it. And she was the only midwife that I talked to that had no fear of anything that was related to birth. That when I asked her the same question of how would you feel if I chose you as my midwife and we were looking at a breech delivery, and she said, if we were in that circumstance, we would pray together about what we would do, and we would make the decision together. And whatever we both have peace about, I would have no fear, and we would handle it. We would face it together. And that to
That's awesome.
me was the kind of provider that I knew God wanted me to to walk this journey with. And
Yeah,
I did I
absolutely. I remember you having a tough time with your decision too because
yeah.
you had 2 choices, and I think that this may have even been before you really felt, before you really got to know Anita a little bit more, but one of the things that you were facing too was that the other midwife was not a Christian.
Yes. Yes, she was not. I followed her on social media, and our views on things were very, very different in our values. And I knew she wasn't a Christian. So I do remember talking to you and Mike about it when I was making the decision, because I kind of felt like I was faced with the decision of one midwife who has all this in-person experience but doesn't share my same faith and values. And this other midwife who maybe doesn't have as much experience, but she shares my faith and values. And also, even though she doesn't have as much experience, maybe, which she has a ton of experience. So I'm just saying with breach,
You
but
just mean
she
breach in
takes
particular.
her
Yeah.
time to be educated on it and
Mhm.
to learn,
Mhm.
and so that she can know, so that when they
Yeah,
so she can take on women who are facing breach, because there's such a
yeah.
hole in the birth world for where women who are facing a breech delivery at 38 weeks, where they go.
Mhm.
So she
Interestingly, your midwife also took a training course from Dr. Stu.
yes, yes, she had been trained by Dr. Stu on breech. So
Yes.
yeah, so obviously she's the one I chose. And I also felt better
Yeah.
about, just to talk about like the logistics of planning this, is I felt more
Mhm.
comfortable delivering at a birthing center because of my living situation. You know, the birthing center was a few minutes from a hospital if there was an emergency. Whereas if I had chose the other midwife, she was a home birth midwife. I would have been in a circumstance of having to figure out the whole Airbnb and delivering there, and
Mhm.
so, yeah, there were a
And when you
lot of
made
factors.
this there were, and when you made this decision, you originally lived out in the country, and then you guys
Yes,
ended up
and then we
moving.
moved. Yeah.
So it
We
all worked out, but I wanna pause for 1 second about this conversation because I think that this could actually be its own episode. Making a decision about providers. I've seen this come up in some of my Christian birth communities, w and the question is to the group, would you feel comfortable with a provider who's not a believer?
who's not
And
what?
would you feel comfortable with a provider who is not a believer, who does
Oh,
not
mhm.
believe in Yahweh, who does not believe in God or any of it?
Right.
Because there's a lot of new
New
age in the
age.
birth world, a lot of new age stuff, a lot of alternative types of folks. And so this question comes up, and everyone has obviously a different opinion, and certainly you're entitled to your own opinion, anybody. But this was something that you had to face, is what I'm trying to just
Yes.
emphasize here that you had to make a decision. I know Anita is a believer. This other midwife
Yeah.
is not. And, how much weight does that have in my decision? So,
Right.
just
Yeah, and that definitely ended up being the tipping point for me. I remember Mike saying, "When you're in your labor time," this is the gentle Mike voice, "When you're in your labor time, what God do you want your midwife praying to?" Do you want her
question, Mike.
praying for you to the same God that you believe in, or bringing
Different
in
one.
some other kind of demons? I don't know. Anyway,
He probably
as a
didn't say that,
believer,
but
we're a Christian podcast. If you're listening to this and you're not a Christian and this doesn't pertain to you, then that's fine, but these are parts of the decision for us because
Mhm.
I do make my decisions prayerfully, and I think at the time I was tempted of like this other situation. Now that I'm on the other side of this, I can see how significantly important it is to be with a
Mhm.
provider that shares my same
Your
religious
beliefs. Yes.
beliefs, and that we'll get into that more on the next episode when we're actually going through my birth story. So this
Speaking
is
about
just
prayer, though, I do have a quick question for you. What were you praying leading up to your birth? So, obviously, I'm sure we already said you were praying that the Lord would lead you to the right midwife. What other prayers
and he
did you
did.
have or other what?
So the from getting pregnant until pretty much halfway through my second trimester, my prayer was to have a head down baby. That I is all I wanted. And like I said before, it's not necessarily that I was afraid of it because I ended up choosing someone who's very comfortable with it. And we were going to walk through that together if that's what we were facing. But I felt like I was walking in faith to have a different birth experience. And there was enough things like a VBAC after two C-section, having a bicornuate uterus, there was enough things that it's like, please just take this one thing off my plate of breech baby too. Like it would just be great to have a head down baby. So it would give me confidence. That's what I felt like. I would have even
Yeah.
more confidence in my birth. I didn't want to
Mhm.
face if it would bring up fear if I didn't have a breech baby. So that was my prayer from that point on. And so not only was that what I was praying for, but that is another thing I want to talk about of significance of what I did throughout my whole pregnancy in preparation for birth was preparing for the position of the baby from very, very early on. I didn't just wait until I was in the third trimester. I started pretty much halfway through the second trimester. I went searching on the internet again to find a Webster certified chiropractor. And Webster technique is I honestly can't really I'm not a chiropractor so I can't explain what exactly it entails, but it is a certain certification and that chiropractors get for working on pregnant women in the pelvic area to not only like essentially I'm not explaining this very well. I'm gonna
You want
say
me to explain the technical definition?
yes, please.
The Webster technique is a specific chiropractic analysis and diversified adjustment with the goal of the adjustment to reduce the effects of subluxation and or SI joint dysfunction. And doing so helps the neurobiomechanical function of the sacrum and the
Yes,
pelvic regions.
yes.
So that's the technical
So
explanation for
eh,
what it means to
yeah,
be Webster certified.
and chiropractors who use the Webster technique on pregnant women, it helps position the pelvis or open up the pelvis and all those ligaments for optimal positioning for the baby. Not just head down, but also what's it called when it's the baby's facing your spine
Oh,
and not
posterior
sitting
versus
posterior.
anterior.
Yes. Yes,
Mhm.
Webster technique also helps optimal positioning like having a posterior baby. So, I I knew about the Webster technique. Your chiropractor had even mentioned to me that that would be his recommendation because you live in a different state. And
Mhm.
I found a Webster certified chiropractor in my area, and she's really great. And she even offered like maternity packages for women who are pregnant to go twice a week to be adjusted for my whole pregnancy. So starting at about, I think I was about around 15 weeks, I started going to the chiropractor twice a week. And I also every single day would do spinning baby stretches And if you don't know what spinning babies is, it's supporting your body in similar way of stretching to loosen the ligaments that hold up your pelvic area, and also doing certain things like inversions and stuff like that, just to help support optimal positioning for the baby. So I
Mhm.
started doing all of that in my second trimester, and I was also praying and working towards that around 25 weeks. I knew from my experience before that that's kind of when my baby's position is set. If they're my first two were both breech at 25 weeks, they never flipped again. And they were
Mhm.
stuck because my uterus is a different shape. And so my theory was if I had a head down baby around 25 weeks, then he would be stuck because he wouldn't be able to flip up, and then we'd be good to go. I had an anatomy scan and found out he was another boy and health. And then shortly after that, I really felt like he was going to be breech. I felt like I was only feeling kicks down low, which with when you have a breech baby, their head is kind of up in your lung and they stomp around on your bladder. And I was feeling movement like that again, and I felt a lump up high. And I said that to my midwife at a checkup, and she's like, I'm gonna get in there, and I'll be able to determine his position." And she's like, "This is his bum, that he's head down." She double checked she actually had a portable little ultrasound like that hooked up to her phone, which I didn't even know that
Mm.
technology existed. I don't think it's like very good ultrasound. She confirmed down low
Mm.
that his head was way down low. And
Mhm.
that day was so exciting for me. A lot of
Mhm.
women might not feel that excitement, but it was just like 6 months of what I had been praying and working for every day came to came to fruition, and that prayer was
Mhm.
answered, and I knew he would be head down from that point on. So I at that point I just like walked with so much more confidence in my plans for my birth.
Mhm.
And my midwife, she was like starting to get excited because we had talked a lot about breach and like going over my fears. And that's the amazing thing about working with a midwife other than an OB, instead of OB, I mean, is when you go to OB, they're like in and out of the room in 5 minutes and like don't even talk to you except for ask you
Mhm.
questions and like, "Do you have any questions for me?" Like a midwife like sits there with you, says, "You look like you need a hug today. Can I hug you?" And
Yeah.
talks to me about all my fears. When my dog died, she gave me a special tincture that would help me with my depression
Oh.
because she also is a master herbalist. So she knew a lot of the head junk that I had for breech.
Mhm.
And she
Mhm.
had said once we knew he was head down, "Man, I was kind of getting excited for a breech birth. So I guess you ruined our fun with all your chiropractic care." So I will say that I really believe that paid off. I am a
Mhm.
huge advocate for chiropractic care in pregnancy. I also, this is one of the reasons I wanted to share about this, is that if I think that every pregnant woman should do this regularly in pregnancy, and don't start it in your third trimester, but try to start it at least, you know, some of the time earlier on. It will,
Mhm.
and it helps with so much more than just positioning too, like back pain, hip pain, heartburn. She would help me with. So I really have a good experience with chiropractic care in pregnancy. I think it's just a
Mhm.
great way to support your body. And no, so another thing I wanted to get into about preparation, and this is something I know that we have talked a little bit about before, is also eating and like the supplements we take, like not just a
Mhm.
prenatal, which I was very on top of very high quality supplements because of where I had come from previously to my pregnancy. And if you haven't listened to those episodes, it's my journey with infertility and being healed, and using supplements was a big part of that for me. So I continued to support my body nutritionally as best I could. I was very sick at the beginning of this pregnancy. So it was kind of hard to take any pill. Like, I guess what I mean when I say supplements is a big thing that I think is huge in pregnancy is taking beef liver. If you could do it raw, that'd be great. I never in a million years could do that pregnant. So I took desiccated beef liver, and even that I
Yeah,
would throw up sometimes because you can taste it and they're gross. But liver is so good for
yeah.
you in pregnancy. It has so many vitamins and minerals that your body and the baby needs growing. So I really thought of that a lot. My really good friend Paula Carper, who we've had on the podcast, she's a functional dietitian. She got me a book early in my pregnancy called, what is it called? Rebecca, you have it too.
I have
Nutrition
it
for
right
Pregnant.
here. Real
Okay.
Food for Pregnancy. It's literally sitting on my
Real
desk.
Food
Real
for
Food for
Pregnancy by Lily Nichols. I highly recommend that book if you're pregnant or planning to get pregnant. It is
Mhm.
so informative. It's written very easy to read and also has really great tips and recipes and like food plans and stuff like that. So I read that book and I tried to stick to it as best I could. I mean, I'm not perfect. I don't eat a perfect diet and eat all the eggs and liver, obviously, and salmon. I couldn't do that. It's gross.
You're bringing up a good point, and maybe we do an episode or 2 on pregnancy nutrition, because when you say
Yeah.
supplements, you don't mean, like, go to Walmart and buy
Oh, no. I
a
spent a ton
prenatal
of
off
money
of
on
the shelf, which I think is what
no.
is commonly taught in the obstetric world is prenatal,
Yes.
prenatal. The issue with the prenatal is that you need to address the specific deficiencies for your own body.
Right.
And a lot of times these prenatals, you're giving yourselves things that you don't need and can't process the right way. So maybe we'll
Right, and then
sidebar that just to say,
that's a good idea because 'cause I'm, like, very briefly glossing over this for the sake of time, but we could
yes,
definitely have
yes.
a whole episode on pregnancy nutrition that I think would be very helpful
I
from the
also
things
think,
we learned.
sorry to cut you off. I also think you said something before that can spark its own conversation, which is you mentioned obviously there's fear around or concern around breach because you've had breach before, or even maybe I don't even want to say expectation, but it was kind of almost it could happen. So now I want to do these physical things to try to prevent that from happening. There are a lot of people in the birth world right now that think you can do all the things in the world and the baby's going to quote choose their position. And I think we could have a side conversation about, or an actual conversation about that at another time. So I just want to kind of put a
Mhm.
pin in that.
Yeah.
I don't, my personal opinion and belief is that there's never a disadvantage to exercise, stretching,
Mhm.
or treating your body with care.
Right.
When we
Yeah.
because a lot of times this is said and to people that don't do anything
I
normally, like
didn't do
don't work
anything my
out
first
or
2
maybe
times. Yeah, I didn't do anything my
or
first 2
don't,
times, and I had
yeah.
2 breech babies, and this time I
Yes.
did do things, and I didn't have a breech baby, so
So it's an interesting conversation to have, and I think it's bigger than just what we can go through today, but I just want to
yeah.
stick some pins in some of these mini conversations that we're
Yeah.
having. I'm a huge fan of chiropractic during pregnancy because I do believe our bodies get into a state of misalignment constantly,
Mhm.
especially with the lifestyles that we live. In
Yes.
particular, that I'm sitting for work, or I might not I'm not working my body to the best of its abilities and advantages. And so our bodies do need help sometimes with some of these
Yes.
adjustments, let's say.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that would be a good topic as well. Yeah,
But
so
yeah, go ahead. Tell us the last part of what you really want us to experience before we get to your birth, because that's what we're going to talk
Mhm.
about next time.
So, yeah, the things preparation-wise, other than what I've already gone through, is as I got to the end, my midwife did give options for, a big thing as you go into the third trimester is doing a glucose test because gestational diabetes can be a big deal late in pregnancy. and for the baby. And her big thing was informed consent for everything. So for everything that I is typically done in pregnancy, it was asking if I wanted to do it or not. And if I said no, it was okay. If I had questions, it's let's go through the research together. And if you feel comfortable, great. Here's your options for what we can offer. If not, that's great too. So there were certain things I declined. Like I personally declined the GBS test, and but the diabetes test I decided to do, but instead of doing that nasty toxic drink that isn't even always accurate, they my
What are you
midwife
talking
would
about? The flame retardant?
yes,
Just kidding.
exactly, the flame retardant drink. The method that is more accurate that she had me do was actually to bring home a diabetes monitor where you prick your finger and you test it and write down and track what you're eating for a week. And the reason is because my midwife's model is all about empowerment. And if anything seems a little off, how can they support me and I support my body diet wise? So actually, when I did that, my blood sugar level came back borderline high, which was kind of surprising. I hadn't dealt with that in the past, although I had taken the nasty
Mhm,
drink in the past. And so they they supported me in a ton of information and how to eat in a way that wouldn't spike my blood sugar. But because I also had that pregnancy nutrition book, who she actually is a nutritionist for pregnant women with diabetes. So there's a lot of information of that in the book. I knew what to do. And what to do is to eat more protein than you ever want to eat in your whole life and to be protein forward in everything that you eat. And
mhm,
and once I did that for another week or two, my blood sugar level was much better. So she said that I went from pre-diabetic to in the safe range. So I was good. I didn't have to keep tracking. I didn't have to keep doing the blood glucose monitoring. But I liked that aspect of, and the reason I'm even bringing it up is that it was all about information, supporting my body nutritionally and putting in the work, because my midwife said that there's women, pregnant women, who get those readings and then they tell them what to do and then they still continue to just eat ice cream and chips and candy bars and sodas, and then they go full on diabetic.
mhm,
And so having the information, to it empowered me of, not that like I never had to treat again the rest of my pregnancy, but I was much more cautious and careful because
mhm.
I was working my butt off for a VBAC for 9 months. I was not going to go diabetic and let that ruin my VBAC. So, and she
I
also
I
gave
think
because
I think you bring up a really good point here on nutrition. Another pin that we could talk about is aside from just the prenatal conversation, but just nutrition in general during pregnancy. And if you think about it, if you had chosen to get, even if you did the fresh test instead of doing the toxic one, you could have potentially gotten a reading that was okay and then just
Mhm.
moved on, but been pre diabetic and continued to not support your body in the right way. It's kind of cool how that decision to track your diet and all that ended up leading you down a road where you learned about nutrition even more and how important it is and how every little thing impacts the body. I know I'll share this when we talk about my most recent one, but I had an issue where I felt some swelling and ended up having this whole big moment learning about how much caffeine impacts our bodies when
Mhm.
we're obviously not pregnant, but also when we're pregnant, and just how a tiny little thing like cutting out coffee, which is going to make a lot of people cry, but
Yeah.
it can make a
I
huge
don't drink
difference.
coffee in pregnancy. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that really will be a great topic to cover, because I actually had preeclampsia in my first pregnancy, which can also possibly be prevented or maybe controlled through diet as well. Possibly. That's a little more complicated, but
Yes.
that's a whole
Yep.
nother topic as well. So yeah,
Mhm.
these are the things that I was doing at the end. And another thing is when I would have, once you're at the end, I was going to my midwife once a week, and she would always test my urine to check for proteins because that is a marker for preeclampsia, and also like ketones in your urine. And then it also tests your hydration. And I was always dehydrated. And so one thing my midwives were always pushing on me is you got to drink more water, but not, you don't just drink water, you drink water with electrolytes. If you're just drinking plain water, it's just flushing through your system and it actually can do more harm than good. You have to drink
Mhm.
remineralized water, whether that's just a pinch of salt or using, a hydration multiplier like an electrolyte mix. And so I became obsessive about my electrolytes, and I was like determined every appointment, I'm not going to be dehydrated this appointment. Like, yeah, you're still dehydrated. Like I could not drink enough water apparently. But I thinking back, I think that was really good. And one thing I didn't really realize at the time is, how when you're having a hospital birth, they insist on sticking an IV in your hand and so that they can give you IV fluids if you need it, is one of the
Mhm.
reasons that hydration is so important going into your birth in the final few weeks, is so that you are extra hydrated for birth. So if you're not at the
Mhm.
hospital, you don't really have, I mean, I guess my midwife, she could have done IV fluids if I really needed it, but to
Mhm.
have your blood, you're preparing to lose a lot of blood, to be hydrated going into a very intense experience is very important. And it'll keep you going. Just like if you were going to run a marathon, you're not going to do that not having drank any water the day before. You need
Sure,
to
or
be
ever.
hydrated. Yeah, yeah,
Or
exactly.
for the last 9 months.
Yes. So I became very passionate about that. And then because of your influence and your experience with herbs and being such an advocate for red raspberry leaf tea, I did this, followed your advice, and I made up huge batches of red raspberry leaf tea and had it in a pitcher in my fridge. What I would do, because I was so obsessive about the hydration, is I would have my cup I always have, and I would fill it halfway with red raspberry leaf tea, pour electrolytes in it, and fill it the rest of the way with water. And I would drink like 4 to 5 of them a day. So I was drinking a ton of red raspberry leaf tea. And I liked it. I liked and red raspberry. I also had a mix of other herbs in there, what like the blend Nora, which is what, nettles, oat straw, red raspberry leaf, and what's the A, alfalfa?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes.
all of those herbs are really good for you in your final stages of pregnancy because they are very mineral rich, and they're really going to help support your body as you're preparing to do this really hard thing. And also, the red raspberry helps tone your uterus and help prepare it. And I really wanted, like I said, I wanted to be as prepared as I could. And then the last thing I did in the final stages that I know you are not a fan of is I ate a ton of dates. The recommended amount is to eat 3 large dates a day from, I think it's like 37 weeks on or something. And I did that every single day. And there is actually scientific research backing up the dates thing, that it shortens the time of labor and softens your cervix and certain things like that. So I really stuck to that and drank my tea, ate my dates, and made them in all kinds of different ways that made them actually taste good.
Just to clarify, when she says I'm not a fan of the dates, it just means I don't like dates. So
Yeah,
I don't eat them
because
because I
they're
don't like
disgusting.
them. I think they're
Yeah, when
gross.
Rebecca came, she lives in Tennessee, I live in Texas. She came when I was 39 weeks, 5 days or something, because we had planned for her to be at the birth. So I needed to make it to that point. We didn't know when I was going to go into labor. And I was making that recipe that's like date Snickers. Essentially, you like coat them in peanut butter and dip them in chocolate. And that's how I would eat my dates. And I was like, you got to try it. This is how, this is, and she was also pregnant. 2 months behind me, and you did say that that one was okay, but you weren't willing to go through the work to make them yourself.
They were good. They tasted good, but to me, I was like, it didn't make sense to be eating candy date treats. You know?
Well,
If
that
I
yeah.
had to eat them because they were candy, then it didn't make sense to me, and I just can't do dates. They gross me out. They look like little roaches. I don't like when they're pitted. Obviously, you can buy them unpitted, but it was a whole thing. Anyway, so let's
Yeah,
summarize how you prepared. You prepared,
yeah.
first of all, spiritually. That's the number one thing. It was communicating with God, praying, Lord, please, please bring this baby out naturally, head down, all that good stuff. Then you also prepared with your nutrition. You were on top of it. You had the right care team. You did your research on your care team. You physically prepared, chiro,
Stretching.
stretching, other things. And then some of the pregnancy things like red raspberry, dates, all that kind of stuff. What are we missing? I feel like there's one thing
Oh,
that's missing.
there is one thing I
Mentally.
yes, the mentally. So, just to go through that really quick, I we had on our podcast early on Brittany from the Biblical Birth School,
Mhm,
and she's a great resource on Instagram, and she has classes training birth workers, Christian women who want to become birth workers, whether it's a doula or something like that. And she also came out with a course for pregnant women preparing spiritually and mentally in birth. And so I purchased her course and I took that as well. That that was my mental and spiritual prep, taking her course, and it was really helpful of getting me thinking about certain aspects of things and focusing on certain things and highlighting things for me to pray about. So that was that element for my prep. I know, and we'll talk about in your birth story episode again, that you are a big advocate for hypno babies, and so I went a different route and
mhm,
it looks differently, but there were aspects like just having you as my sister and you being, such an advocate for the hypno babies mentality that I inherited a little bit of thinking positively. Like I didn't
mhm.
dwell on negatives. Yes, there were like you were would always talk about the fear clearing. You need to clear your fears of a breech baby or things like that. And so, I would do that in my own way of bringing it to the
Yeah,
Lord and
yeah.
praying about
Mhm,
my fears. But like I said, I really didn't have any. I really felt very confident. I was dedicating my life to this birth
mhm.
and I knew that the
You were
Lord was with me. I
trusting
knew
God's design for your body.
yes, I was trusting my body. I had the right team. So, I will say to wrap this up that I believe number 1, the most important thing you can do if you want to have a physiological birth is to bring it to the Lord and to trust him and to bring him into your plans and to have him walk with you through that. And number
Mhm,
2 is picking your team. Who is going to be at your birth? Because you get to choose that. You don't have to just go with who's convenient. My midwife, once I moved, was still an hour away. And I think that I hear that a lot from women of like, oh, well, I want to go to this birthing center because it's really close to me. It's 20 minutes away. It is better to deal with a commute and to choose someone who's going to support you and share your values than to choose convenience. So that to me is what I did over and over again throughout my prep is not choosing convenience, choosing the hard thing and knowing that I could do it, that my body was made for this and that the Lord was with me.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, which we're gonna talk more about next week when we talk about your birth story. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention in this episode before we move forward, and then we'll reflect back on how your prep helped or didn't help during labor?
Yeah, no, I
Or
think
did you
this
go
is
into labor?
yeah, yeah. Am I still pregnant? No.
Cliffhanger.
This is this is I will say that we're gonna leave off on I do have a cliffhanger. There was one thing that I think I could have improved on prepping, and that is being more physically fit, like working out, doing upper body, and yes, I was doing stretching and I walked every day for the most part, but actually, like, staying fit in pregnancy is the one thing I did not prioritize, and that came back to bite me in the butt a little bit for my labor, so I'm gonna leave us off there, that
Yeah. Okay.
in my labor story, I will talk about how that was actually really important. So,
Perfect. Perfect. Well, thank you for sharing with us today the pre story. I'm sure everybody can't wait to hear what happened because this is pretty wild. You are about to share about laboring and birthing physiologically after two breech C section births. So stay tuned for next week. We're going to talk about Rachel's story. And thank you for tuning in and being on this journey with us. If you'd like to follow along outside the podcast, you can still do it on Instagram and Facebook, same place as always, or on YouTube at The Radiant Mission. Or you can watch it as a video on YouTube. That's the difference. Today, we're going to close with Proverbs 3, verses 5 through 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. We're wishing you a radiant week, and we will see you next time. Bye,
bye,
everyone.
guys.